Oh, wow.
So you think he could have either broken his femur or he hyperextended his knee?
Well, he hyperextended it for sure. That's how this thing broke. But, if he broke his femur, he may have also just torn up everything else there as well. I think he ripped out every ligament there, and then it got to the bone, and from looking at that, because it doesn't look like it's a mid-shaft femur fracture in the middle of the bone, right in the middle of the bone. It looks like it's down at the bottom, because his knee does this.
You probably still get some fans going, they said he could go.
So you say there's a chance. For this episode, we're just going to be focusing on the teams that made the playoffs and their injuries. Starting off with the nastiest looking ones first.
Watch it's his left leg. And it's hard to tell, but he gets caught with the right leg and then the left leg.
So, Deandre Baker, cornerback for the Chiefs, injured in the game with the LA Chargers. Pretty nasty looking. So if you look actually at the tape, it looks like he's running, chasing down his man.
Does it look like he's running, or is he running?
So if you look at the tape, he's running after that player, trying to catch him, plants his left foot, grabs the jersey, and his knee hyperextends, and then you see that nasty-looking femur fracture. At least that's what we're told has happened. It's a femur fracture. I can see that happening, but I think this is more because of the hyperextension he had to the knee. Initially, when I heard that he had a femur fracture with a non-contact injury, I started thinking to myself, remember that guy, David Rebecki, the pitcher for San Francisco Giants, who had the pathologic fracture of his humerus because he had a malignancy in it?
Rebecki gives him a look. Here's the pitch to the plate, and it goes all the way to the screen. Rebecki falls down and grabs his left shoulder, and he is hurting.
That's what I thought initially, but when I looked at the tape, didn't think that as much. Here's why. If you look at the tape, he plants his left foot. He's wearing cleats, so it's going to catch the turf. He's grabbing onto the jersey of the player he's trying to bring down. He's pulled forward, hyperextends. I think he may have torn all the ligaments in his knee, in particular, posterior capsule, posterior lateral corner, ACL, PCL, and he probably did fracture the distal part of his femur, just above where the thigh bone, the femur bone, flares out. I think that's what happened. It's kind of interesting because this is probably the worst case scenario that could have happened to Mike Evans in his injury, which we're going to talk about in a minute here. So again, let's look at the structures around the knee. So, is there just a knee bone model?
I don't think so.
I have all that shit at home. I should bring it in here. The knee joint is surrounded by a capsule. For those of you who know something about cars, think of the joint capsule as sort of like the CV boot around the CV joint in a car, right? So that capsule wraps around the joint. It provides some structural stability to that joint. It also releases joint fluid that provides nutrients to the structures inside that joint. So with a hyperextension injury, you're going to stress the structures in the posterior part of the knee. So in the back of the knee, remember from a talk we gave some time ago about hamstrings, you have the biceps femoris with its two heads, the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. You could also tear those, right? So remember those attach at the tibia, which is the bone just below the knee joint, and they start off way up in the pelvis. So they cross two joints, the hip joint and the knee joint, but in this case, with a hyperextension injury, they're going to be damaged at the knee joint, distally. The other thing that can happen, depending on how the knee is positioned at the time of the injury, is you could rupture the ACL or the PCL. ACL is probably the one that's going to rupture first. But if the knee is actually not straight and is in this position, which we call valgus, sometimes people call this knock-kneed, that's when you see an ACL injury, okay? When the knee is in a valgus position. And this usually happens in athletes when they're running, they plant their foot and they try to turn. Happens in football players, happens in soccer players. If you look at this injury, actually, his knee is in varus. In other words, it's bowed out. So since it's a similar mechanism to what happened with Mike Evans, and the injury is kind of on a different spectrum, we'll just talk about it right now. Mike Evans' knee was straight when he had his injury compared to Deandre Baker. So if you look at Deandre Baker's, his knee's in varus. This is why I think he probably tore the lateral structures of his knee, right? Because that's where the stress was. If you bend the knee this way, lateral structures are going to be injured. I think his posterior capsule was injured. I think he probably tore his ACL, may have even tore his PCL. And if they're saying he has a femur fracture, I think that femur fracture is happening at the distal portion of the femur, because you don't really see the bending at the middle of the thigh, right? So I think this is a distal femur injury, and I think he's also ruptured a lot of ligamentous structures and tendons around his knee. He's going to be out for quite some time, and this is definitely going to require surgery. So, Mike Evans, if you look at this tape, similar thing. He's running to catch the ball, and he tries to slow down to catch it. Plants his left foot, and you can see this. So his hip is flexed, his knee plants, and remember, as I said, the position of his knee is really critical to the injury pattern that's going to happen. His knee is straight. It's not valgus or varus. In other words, not knock-kneed or bow-legged. It's straight. He wasn't turning. He does have his foot planted. His cleats have grabbed onto the ground. He's pulled forward because of his momentum, so he's flexed at his hip, and he hyperextends his knee because he's trying to slow himself down. So, structures are most likely injured in him. Posterior joint capsule could have been stretched or torn depending on how bad the injury is. Hamstring tendons could have been stretched or torn depending on how bad the injury is. He didn't have his knee in valgus or varus, so I don't think he damaged the medial or lateral collateral ligaments. I don't think he damaged his ACL. Probably has a bone bruise because as those bones do this, the front of the femur and the tibia are going to bang together, and he's going to have a contusion or bone bruise as it's called. Per report, I don't think he damaged his ACL. I don't think he damaged his posterior capsule. I don't think he damaged his posterior lateral capsule because that's not what the MRI shows. He probably does have a bone bruise. So, two very similar mechanisms, but very different outcomes based on how the knee was positioned, how the foot was planted, and probably how much force was involved as well. So, one guy's probably playing next week, one guy's going to be out for quite some time and requiring surgery. So, next up, let's talk about Jamal Adams, safety for Seattle, injured in the game against the 49ers. They're saying he's hopeful that he's going to play. He's 100% going to play. It's the playoffs. What I think happened to him is he has an AC joint injury. He looked miserable on the sidelines, and it didn't look like he had dislocated his shoulder or anything like that. I think this is an AC joint injury. He'll play through it, so he's going to be in the playoffs. This here is going to hurt like a every time he gets hit or hits somebody.